The knightly helmets of the classical Middle Ages were beautiful, strong as a rock, reliable, like St. Peter keeping the gates of heaven, well, beautiful, where without it? They reliably protected their owner from everything that changeable military love had prepared for him: arrows, swords, battle axes. What can I say? Even a knightly strike used to ricochet off such a helmet. But even such a wonderful helmet had a weak side. Actually, even two. Firstly, nothing was visible in these closed helmets, and secondly, they cost some completely obscene amounts of money. And if the military aristocracy was not used to saving on themselves, their beloved, in the end, it was a matter of banal survival. Then even on the squad, not to mention the other infantry army, there were no such helmets. And it's not that this infantry was sorry, not at all. However, the tools of war, which had been significantly strengthened since the early Middle Ages, made this mass of infantry, stuck in the Dark Ages, completely unsuitable as a means of warfare. Protected, like their ancestors, by the tribal militia, almost exclusively by a shield, the infantry of the early classical Middle Ages suffered some simply monstrous losses, encountering not only heavy cavalry, but also archers. These vile types, being brought together in large detachments, began to literally mow down not very mobile and completely unarmored infantrymen. The infantry urgently needed more or less serious protection, just so that it could somehow be used on the battlefield. And the first step on this path was thick quilted jackets that could keep the arrow at an end. Together with large shields, this gave the foot soldiers some chance to survive. Well, at least before the hand-to-hand fight. But this was still not enough. The infantry needed a helmet that could protect, if not the most important part of the body of yesterday's peasant, but absolutely necessary for him to continue to fight. And in addition to strength, simplicity, and the ability to mass-produce it, this helmet had to be cheap, the cheapest. And, of course, such a helmet appeared, in general, with a variety of helmets at the beginning of the classical Middle Ages. Everything was in order. The descendants of the Norman, spanged helm, tablet, Phrygian cap and all their diversity filled the battlefield. But they all had one big common problem. On the one hand, being originally a simple semicircular or conical dome, they rather mediocrely protected their owner from the numerous dangers of battle, leaving open not only the face, but also the base of the skull and especially the neck. On the other hand, immediately, like these helmets, masks appeared that covered the face, as well as plates protecting the neck. They turned into a closed cap with very mediocre visibility, suitable mainly only for equestrian strikes, but of little use in foot combat. A compromise was needed, and it was found at the very beginning of the 13th century. To the Spain helm, which was pretty outdated by that time, some smarthead came up with the idea of adding wide metal fields, turning the old reliable helmet into an analog of a metal hat. It looked so similar to an ordinary peasant straw headdress that they called it that. Eisenhut in Germany, chapelle in France, chapelaine in Italy. All this, if translated into the great and mighty, will mean iron hat. The helmet turned out to be so successful that it immediately spread in European armies and territories from Byzantium to the Iberian Peninsula and began to live its own life. So what was so great about this rather ridiculous helmet, you ask me? And almost everything, dear reader. Chapelle turned out to be an almost perfect helmet, hitting the right time and place with exceptional precision. And first of all, of course, it was simple and cheap. At the beginning of the classical Middle Ages, the outdated span helm was taken as the basis of the helmet, which consisted of 3 metal strips and 4 more details that formed the dome vault, and it was still the cheapest helmet of that time. He did not require any forge welding, nor long-term drawing of a metal sheet, just a couple of dozen rivets in one evening to assemble all these elements. The wide metal fields added to the finished design did not complicate it very much, which means that the helmet turned out to be massive. And this alone was enough for the helmet to be considered good. But, of course, that was not all. Secondly, the hat perfectly protected its owner. The wide, slightly beveled metal fields of the helmet covered not only the head, but also partly the shoulders of the infantrymen from the arrows of archers, who most often fired with mounted fire. An arrow at the end definitely could not pierce such a helmet, ricocheting from it, which, together with a large shield and a thick quilted jacket, already gave more than acceptable protection, allowing the infantrymen to get to the battle without unnecessary holes in the body. And in hand-to-hand combat, the hat showed itself well. All chopping blows coming at the owner from above usually slipped off the rounded dome and went down along the metal field, most often without causing much harm to the owner. This was especially important when the unfortunate infantryman was cut down by the knightly cavalry. Attacks from above from a horse into a dense infantry formation, of course, did not become completely ineffective, but it became much more difficult to hit infantry protected in this way. By the way, from frontal blows to the face, the hat also allowed you to close, simply by tilting your head forward, exposing it to a blow or injection. Wide metal field. Thirdly, a hat, providing more than good protection to a foot soldier, almost without limiting his view, and this was something that in a foot battle is difficult to overestimate. Unlike the closed helmets of the classical Middle Ages, which were, to put it mildly, difficult to use on foot, and it was not surprising that this simple helmet, which originally appeared as a means of protecting infantry, already in the middle of the 13th century began to be actively used by chivalry, and even by the highest aristocracy, if they had to fight on foot. However, we also see riders in hats in medieval miniatures, albeit in small quantities. Military progress, however, did not stand still, improving the weapons and armor of medieval armies. He did not bypass our today's hero. Very soon, the archaic span helm ceased to be the basis of the hat. New, advanced technologies have made it possible to assemble the dome from two halves using forge welding, or even pull it entirely from one large metal sheet, which, in the presence of stiffeners, made the structure even more durable and incomparably lighter, and it was in this form that the helmet acquired its mass character, becoming, perhaps, the most common infantry helmet of the second half of the classical Middle Ages. It seems to have been used by everyone: infantry and crossbowmen, knights, and archers. Even the kings did not hesitate to put it on their royal head. Chapelle it up even on the miniatures that depicted the detachments of the ship's landing force, which were landed on enemy coasts by medieval commanders. Time passed, wars changed, and the hat changed with them. First of all, of course, in the direction of even greater simplification. Along with a helmet with a rounded dome, we also see simpler versions of it, with short cylindrical or pointed domes, assembled from two halves. Such changes did not greatly affect the quality of helmet protection, but they had an excellent effect on its mass character, and that was the point. By the beginning of the 14th century, the fields of the cape increased even more and sank to the bottom, and the helmet itself often began to resemble a bell. He was now worn somewhat shifted to the back of the head, reliably protecting not only the shoulders, but also the upper back of the owner. Also, special cuts began to be made in wide fields so that even by tilting your head forward, you could see what was happening on the battlefield. But the weapon's idea, of course, did not stop there. By the end of the 14th century, to protect the face under the cap, they began to put on a buveur, a special plate collar, turning into a half mask protecting the lower half of the face. This seriously improved head protection, while not impairing visibility at all, which was extremely important for an infantry helmet. It was approximately in this form that the hat existed throughout the later Middle Ages, until the very early New Age, until the tactics of big battalions and the massing of artillery on the battlefield made wearing armor unfashionable. The armor began to decrease, losing individual elements, gradually turning from full-plate armor simply into cuirasses, often even without tassets and plate gloves. Helmets also massively lost their visors, buveurs, and other elements of additional armor. And how, against the backdrop of all this technological progress, did the hat feel? And you know, dear reader, wonderful. Like other helmets, he lost his extra protective elements and turned into a cab-asset helmet. And a little later, and in the known to everyone, mainly, of course, from films and books about the discovery of America, the Morion helmet, having changed outwardly, but remaining, in fact, the same chapel helmet that appeared in Europe at the beginning of the 13th century. Field dome, chin strap, nothing extra. In this form, the helmet went with the Spanish soldiers throughout South and Central America, not forgetting, however, at the same time Old Europe. Until the end of the 17th century, in one form or another, our hero was used in all the wars of all European states, from the Scottish mountains to the Mediterranean. And only with the almost complete disappearance of helmets from the armies of the warring states almost completely disappeared from the battlefield. However, not for long. Already in the 19th century, chapelle returned, this time in the form of an infantry helmet. Turned out to be so successful that it was used by the British and Allied armies throughout the First and Second World Wars. But even on this, however, the head did not come down, and even after they ended, until the end of the 60s of the last century, every now and then appeared in service with individual detachments of local troops in Africa and East Asia. Here is a story about a helmet that appeared as a simple ersatz to protect a simple infantryman and has not lost its relevance for 9.5 centuries. A helmet that began its journey during the days of chivalry and song. At its sunset, the first man flight into space. The world, my dear viewer, if you look closely, is not changing at all as much as it seems to you and me. But that's a completely different story.